Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever it may be, dear listeners. Welcome to Silk Slippers, Episode 0, the first of what I hope to be many conversations that I will have with you. This is the pilot episode of what I hope to be a sort of general podcast where I can sit down and have a conversation. Apologies if you get some back noise. I have some distant neighbors who have a dog that doesn't just barks, but shrieks and yaps incessantly, so I can't tell if that's coming through or not, but apologies if it is. We're just going to push forward with it. I want to talk about the recent events surrounding stand-up comedian Shane Gillis. And if you're wondering, Shane Gillis, who the hell is that? Isn't that comedian who got blackballed? And we've been over this. This happened a week ago. We've moved on. Well, the speed at which we move on from things is a topic for a different time. But yeah, the Shane Gillis who recently was fired from SNL, some podcast comments and insensitive jokes or attempts at jokes were unearthed, and NBC opted to fire him very quickly within just a few days, I think, after he was announced that he was going to be a new cast member of SNL. By this point, just about everybody has weighed in, and the variety of hot takes pretty much runs the gamut of what you'd expect. Everything from he deserved to be fired to he didn't deserve to be fired. It was an attempt at a joke. It was a joke. It was funny. It wasn't funny. It was mean-spirited. It wasn't mean-spirited. NBC and SNL were justified. They weren't justified. I mean, we know the drill by now, and we know who's probably satisfied with the decision, who isn't satisfied with the decision. But it's a done deal at this point. And although not a lot of time has passed, I think enough time has passed where we can sort of take a step back and analyze the situation, analyze some of the fallout. Shane Gillis himself has commented on the situation, trying to kind of keep a stoic attitude about it, making a couple parting shots along the way, basically trying to signal that he's not really going to change course, that it's not going to affect him. It was a great opportunity, but other opportunities will most likely come down the road for him in the future. Others are saying this is it for him. He's relegated to internet fame only, and he's effectively been blackballed from the industry. But the trajectory of Shane Gillis's career isn't really what I'm wanting to focus on, and it isn't really why I wanted to sit down and talk about this situation. There's a bit of an interesting kind of feeling in the air after this whole firing took place. And what I want to talk about is kind of more of the broad terms of what this means and what seems to be, in my mind, the diminishing returns we're seeing from cancel culture. There is a lot of commentary about what this means for comedy, what type of precedent this perpetuates. And since this isn't really about sexual indiscretions, it's more about actual comments that can be verified and looked up and referenced, but when taken out of context and presented, look worse than perhaps when they're viewed with the proper context and within the context of where they were made and what's appropriate for a comedian, an aspiring celebrity, or even an actual celebrity to be saying. The fact that there is such a wide array of opinions on the actual comments that were made shows me that the people who believe that collecting the scalps of those that say things they don't like in a way they don't like, and that in some way should prevent them from holding certain positions or from climbing up the ladder within show business or any business for that matter. These people pushing for these firings really are fighting a losing battle, and I don't think they even realize it. And the reason I say this is pretty simple. I don't think they're acting in good faith. And I think that's becoming increasingly clear to the average person, the outsiders. And I think the firing of somebody like Shane Gillis, as painful and frustrating as it must be for him and his friends, I'm sure it sucks. But I think in the long run, it's part of a trend that's going to be good for everyone in the long run. You know, when you look at these cases on an individual level, there's always some sort of gray area, especially lately, especially the last few major ones. And since this particular case deals with comments that anyone can sit down and dissect, anyone can read or listen to directly, these comments can sort of act as a litmus test for what you find offensive or what you find a step too far. However, beyond that, I think what this case is also a litmus test for, it represents a clash of old systems with new systems in terms of content creation, what's deemed to be appropriate content, who is deemed to be appropriate to put on a major, 3-letter network. And in this case, a long-running show, a major show, especially one that's been so beloved and considered to be a stepping stone in many a comedian's career. And I think the major shift that we're seeing is the shift in opinion of what constitutes righteous purging of improper behavior and what is sort of becoming petty gatekeeping and elbowing competition out of the way. With the Shane Gillis firing, I think we're starting to see the majority opinion start to lean towards the fact that this could be more petty gatekeeping than anything. And that this group of people, as I said before, just aren't acting in good faith anymore, if they ever were. And you're starting to see a bit of a clash of generations as, the internet has really taken hold, really become a mainstream tool, a mainstream kind of method towards celebrity and building an audience, building fame. You're seeing comedians or celebrities from a previous generation not fully grasp this and kind of zealously defend things like this latest firing and then completely get their knees chopped out from under them with their own words, with their own jokes from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, with their own comments on Twitter from a few years ago. And, as much as people seem to relish in people getting their just desserts one way or the other, what that tells me with all this kind of cross-referencing that's going on is that a lot of this just is being seen as a moot point and not something to just be taken at face value anymore. And I'm kind of dancing around certain buzz phrases like virtue signaling or something like that. Not because that phrase has no utility, but just in an effort to try to not sound trite. But virtue signaling or not, I think a lot of people are trying to come from a good place on this one, but I just don't think they're looking at the big picture, and I don't think they're taking into account just how rapidly things are changing in society, in culture, in just plain technology. And as it often is, comedy really seems to be the no man's land in culture, where these boundaries are sort of being written and rewritten as things change, as people's opinions shift, and as people toe the line or cross the line. And even going back to the Louis thing, which is a much murkier situation than this latest one, because it deals in a combination of accusations, rumor, sexual indiscretion, but not quite serious enough to be considered a full-on crime. No charges are being pressed, but it's certainly outside the norm. In this case, a few racial slurs being uttered on a podcast certainly seems like a much different beast. But it it still ties together, because as Louis tried to come back, the argument that was being made in support of him, even if by those who don't agree with his original actions that led to him, really having to face serious consequences, it's like the thought is, does that justify a totally destroyed career? And also the fact that Louis' return was getting back on stage, sort of getting back on the horse, which is not an easy thing to do, not viewed as something that you can just start right up again. You have to kind of work with some training wheels for a while. And there's some stories circulating about him using notes and sort of, getting back on his feet as quickly as possible. But the expectations that he's just going to come out swinging and he's going to come out with a really good explanation for everything, and that he's going to be as sharp and as funny as he always was, just isn't realistic and isn't appropriate. And the other aspect of his return that was being probably what you could consider overly scrutinized and overly picked apart was that it was a show where he was getting back on his feet that was recorded and exposed. And so in many ways, comedians rallied around him for that one, which was, I don't know, roughly a year after the original news broke out about him, and he lost his jobs and lost money, lost opportunity, basically went into exile for the better part of a year. And he comes back and is basically re-exposed as somebody who's doubling down, hasn't learned anything, isn't addressing anything, when he's just trying to get back on his feet. And comedians seem to view those shows where you test out material, try out material, as sacrosanct, as something that you can't be held accountable to this ridiculous standard. That it is a testing ground. It is a place for you to speak your mind, get your thoughts in order in a public forum with limited to no judgment. And I'm not sure if Shane Gillis's comments on a long-form podcast are really so different. I think the argument can be made that, especially for a generation of up-and-coming content creators, comedians, aspiring celebrities, aspiring comedians, whatever, that long-form conversations, podcasting is all becoming a more integral part of their lives and career. And if the defense of Louis hinges on, well, he's working out material, he needs his chance to get on stage, I think that can very easily extend to getting on a podcast with your friends, getting on a podcast with your peers, and working out material, messing around, working off the cuff, making attempts to be funny, making attempts at jokes. And whether or not they're successful is really not the point. The point is the platform is there and it should be used, and those that would use it as ammunition really aren't any better than those that would use a bootleg recording of Louis testing out material on a stage for the first time in many months. And while there are those that would say that a racial slur was used, therefore that makes it pretty clear that that is inappropriate and not something that should be promoted, I would wager a guess that the vast majority of comedians who have any sort of success in their career have said some pretty crazy, fucked up, wild shit on a stage somewhere. Maybe in the early hours of the morning, maybe in front of 6 people, including mostly other comics. But I'm sure it's happened at least once. Otherwise, I'm not sure what they would be doing otherwise. And so it's just a bit of a double standard to hold somebody going crazy on a podcast, whether it's funny or not, but to hold the stage as this placed where there are no consequences. But oh, that podcast, well, that's an entirely different story. I would say that that's the appeal of a lot of these podcasts. I mean, the explosion of the average celebrity having their own podcast, having their own platform that they control and they dictate is really part of the appeal. You get a direct line to your audience, you get potentially another source of income, and if you are the type of person that works professionally on a stage, you also have another avenue to work out material. And for the audience, it works both ways. The audience now has a direct line to their favorite comedians. They can talk back and forth through Q&A. They have access to those that are willing to be more wild and can listen and enjoy to the type of content that you would only get in that comedy club in the early hours of the morning with nobody there and somebody just cutting loose and going crazy. That environment now is at the fingertips of pretty much everyone at their own convenience, which is a really pretty radical change if you think about it. And if nothing else, NBC and the types of people that would defend the Shane Gillis firing, I think they're just exposing themselves really for being just kind of old and out of touch. I mean, there's really not a nice way to put it, but it's a very limiting belief to think that, those crazy times that are few and far between can be swept under the rug, should be swept under the rug. They'll be forgotten. They won't be recorded in the day and age where everybody has an HD camera in their fucking pocket. And I think it's pretty naive to just believe that those that are willing to cut loose on camera in an uncontrolled environment on a regular basis are the ones that are too much of a risk and don't deserve the same protections that they would have otherwise had if they were on a stage somewhere. There is clearly an audience for the more, loose, freeform content, the hangout podcasts, the podcasts where groups of comedians get together and shoot the shit, joke around, mess around, and get harsh and, brutal at times. And look, it's perfectly fine for NBC to not believe that they need to cater to that kind of audience. But I think the problem that they're going to start running into is that they're going to start running out of options when we're talking about the next generation of content creators. Because I think what a lot of the concern is right now with the precedent that's being set is, well, okay, so anybody that's appeared on more than, a handful of podcasts in the last year can basically be blocked from picking up any kind of position, role, audition, whatever for, SNL, major network shows, sitcoms, those kind of opportunities. Opportunities that many people who, again, like I said, cut loose on stage, but just weren't recorded doing so, would get by putting in the time and effort in their career, as well as, going crazy and then also working clean, and basically being a realistic three-dimensional person with a wide variety of comedic skill sets and talents, and has the different abilities that they can showcase at different times. It's a very interesting proposition to basically say, if anybody has crossed the line ever, that it is reasonable that they just be blacklisted and prevented from having these kind of opportunities. And, the moment somebody raises a stink, they'll be gotten rid of. And, Shane Gillis is not the first, and unfortunately won't be the last by a long shot person to, just sort of be gotten rid of and ousted. But if the reaction to it is any indication, I think that there is certainly a factor of fatigue that's starting to come into play, where, especially in the future, if there is no real opportunity for redemption or second chances, which is kind of the thing we're seeing with Louis, then what happens is when redemption and forgiveness takes a backseat, people just start to tune out. And whether the original firing is justified or not, things start to look a lot more bitter and mean-spirited when someone is hounded for, months or years after the original hit to their career. And in addition to the fatigue I described, I think the major networks especially are going to have to consider what happens when the trust starts to erode to a point where what they offer isn't appealing enough to an up and coming generation of content creators. Because the moment that happens, they're going to be in big trouble. Because, a lot of these content creators and comedians that are coming up are so used to having that level of control over their projects and what they are able to say and what they're able to do, mostly through their online platforms. And they're going to wonder what the benefit is, especially if they've already gotten an established audience. I mean, there is always a higher bar for sure. But if somebody has the level of success that can be reached online even today, and that there's this risk factor associated with trying to become a part of more established media networks, I'm not sure we're too far off from people doing a risk assessment and feeling that it's not worth it. And that really all you're doing at that point is setting yourself up for a fall. Another aspect of that is it can really start to snowball out of control for the established media if that trust erodes to where we get to where they're not viewed as the only game in town, and that the kind of parallel career that you can have with your own autonomy as an aspiring comedian or celebrity or whatever, then what happens is, even if the apparatus is still in place to benefit some, there will be those that take the offers. The problem is that you're going to start to encourage an environment where, and I'm trying to be fair, but basically you encourage the mediocre to take your offers. And those that really have the highest capabilities will start to shun, the opportunities that used to be viewed as the opportunities of a lifetime. Because what good is the opportunity of a lifetime if there is a well-established track record? And again, I'm looking, 5-10 years into the future. But if there's just this laundry list of people who've gotten burned, exiled, and if there is no road to redemption, like there doesn't really feel like there is one right now, then this type of thing could become a reality. So the big question is whether or not in the next 5 to 10 years, the current trend of a viable sort of parallel career path for content creators and the entertainment industry is maintained. It is very likely that things get more difficult in the near future. There are plenty of people who would probably say that it's already happening, where things are starting to be taken away from those that would want to create edgy content online. And so hosting, getting income streams is getting increasingly difficult. I mean, and, up to this point, the kind of conceptual parallel internet is sort of tied to this dark web idea and phrase that's sort of been made to reference a seedy underbelly of the internet. And, it's tied to illegal activity or just heinous crimes and human trafficking and awful stuff. But the problem is that apparatus really isn't necessarily only used for evil. One thing that isn't really being talked about when cancel culture is talked about is the fact that cancel culture really isn't fully canceling anybody. InfoWars still exists. Those that get banned off Twitter still exist. Those that get banned off YouTube still exist. And yeah, they they take a hit to the wallet, they take a hit to the audience level. But, this idea that the genie can be put back into the bottle and that these people who are deemed unfit for mass consumption of their media or whatever content they produce, if they're just going to get kicked into the dark corners, the option to have an online presence, eventually that's going to get to a point where it's going to need to be addressed, at least in the eyes of those in the mainstream and the corporate media conglomerates that exist. But watching TV at your leisure, not having to rely on time slots, has been a thing for 40 years and is basically expected, even by people of an older generation. So the fact that we have roughly 10 to 15 years of both content creators and content consumers that are primarily online, have access to the content that they want pretty much 24/7, and the content creators have free reign to create whatever kind of content they want. And I think it's safe to say that the trend to keep that kind of control is pretty well established at this point, and I think it's going to be very tough, if not impossible, to reverse, at least not without some real consequences. Because we're already seeing a bit of a breakdown of what is being considered the norm just for, the length of content. I think, I've talked about comedy a lot, and I think the concept of the comedy special is being changed pretty radically. And when talking about Shane Gillis and SNL, the idea of a sketch comedy show or any kind of skit comedy or improv comedy, I mean, all of that is online. That's some of the most vulnerable stuff, because not only is the content tailor-made for a very specific audience that's looking for exactly what they want when they want it, but it's being tailored to be bite-sized content that can be consumed very quickly in short bursts. It's ultra long form conversations that are on a wide variety of topics. It's deep dives into specific topics, and often it encourages a very honest and open approach to interacting with an audience, building an audience, and fostering that type of relationship with an audience. Looking back, even as recently as a decade ago, I mean, it's crazy to look back on, what could be considered early YouTube and early video content creation. And it's amazing how far it's come in, around a decade. I mean, we've gone from slideshow, paint animations, and choppy webcam rants to HD video for everybody that has access to a camera, live streaming, very professional skits, even done by people at the hobbyist level. So the quality jump just in a decade by the average person, and the fact that, the average person can come up with a consumer grade studio that rivals anything that a major network could put out. You're talking audio and visual components, sets, props, green screen, everything. I mean, the consumer grade hardware and software has just made huge leaps forward. It's at some point we're going to have special effects just be in the hands of just about everybody. And it's an exciting time for sure. I don't think it is without its problems, though. I think advertising and being susceptible to drops in ad revenue and relying on things like Patreon or crowdfunding does create a fragile environment money-wise for content creators, especially in the last couple of years. And that is one of the major pressure points that I think somebody who's trying to earn a living online through their content faces right now. And even as somebody who's just generally an audience member, I've started to run into a bit of a problem of just hitting a saturation point. As things like the adpocalypses have, really put a dent in content creators and forced them into taking routes like Patreon, it starts to get to a point where it's tough to pick who to give money to. There are a lot of deserving people out there, and you find people you really like and you want to support them. You start to get to 5-10 content creators that you really like, and if they're all locking some or a large amount of their content behind a modest, $5 paywall, you're looking at a pretty big monthly cost just for online content. And I'm not going to say it's not worth it, but like I said, it gets to be frustrating as somebody who wants to be a supporter. You start to feel like you have to juggle different creators and support one month and try to consume the special content that they've locked behind a paywall, and then drop them and pick somebody up, and kind of put people on rotation, which is viable, and it's a little clunky, but it does work. It's certainly not optimal, and you start getting into spending 20, 30, $50. You're looking at the better part of a cable bill already, and it does expose some of the fragility of the Patreon model. It kind of shows that we're in this transition point from it being relatively easy to just toss content out on a host like YouTube and just make money from the ads organically. And now you've really got to try to create an audience that wants to support you directly, which I don't think is inherently a bad thing. But like I said, when you start running into too many people that you want to support who do that, you do have to start making some tough decisions. What I think will probably happen is that we'll start to see more upstart networks for a wide variety of content, not just YouTubers, not just comedians, podcasts, but I think just about everything is going to have to start consolidating. And people may also have to consider being anti-fragile in their hosting options as well, which kind of reinforces the idea that people consolidate under an umbrella and are hosted on a separate website, kind of under their own network banner. And this is all just pure speculation on my part, but I do think that when you look at where online content creation kind of currently is, I don't think the current systems are sustainable. I do think that there are some pretty serious structural problems that will just naturally kind of shake out as time progresses, and as long as there isn't an excessive amount of intervention, from the social media sites themselves or from the government. And so unless the worst happens when it comes to restrictions to the average person to create and consume content online, unless the absolute worst were to happen, I have confidence that people will develop new and innovative ways to deal with some of the current problems we're facing, and come up with ways to both create and distribute content and consume content. And to sort of bring things back full circle to NBC and the other media networks that are focusing on the short-term gain, firing somebody like Shane Gillis for his conduct on a podcast, when weighed against some of the major challenges that the next 5 to 10 years will bring, I just don't think it's a good long-term strategy. And I think that you're seeing a lot of strong emotions being misdirected and taken out on content creators, comedians, people who are aspiring to get into the business. And there's this belief that holding the line is the right thing to do, and that weeding out people is the right thing to do. And in light of other options, it just does not feel like the prudent decision to be acting in what seems to be such bad faith. And I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't advise these networks on how they should approach the coming decade, but I don't think the hour time slot, the half-hour time slot with ad breaks is the path forward. And The path forward probably will be YouTube channels that are promoted, live streaming of content, network content behind paywalls and streaming services, kind of a more homogenous relationship with the current business model that has grown online, both for larger companies like streaming services and sort of the homegrown business model on YouTube. But that's enough speculation for the time being. I'm getting to the point where I want to wrap up, so this mostly came about from the Shane Gillis firing and my thoughts on that, and the pretty mixed reaction to it, even though it, when viewed by itself, isn't a particularly interesting or dramatic firing or, element of cancel culture that's happened in the last few years. When coupled with the reaction to it and the reaction to some of the latest comedy specials that have come out on Netflix and the polarizing feelings between critics and audiences and the very different kind of takes people seem to be having depending on where they are in their careers. It's all very, very interesting to me. And it really does give me pause for thought on how the coming decade is going to flesh out in terms of the current status of the networks, the fragility and cracks forming in the institution of television. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. This has been episode 0 of Silk Slippers. And I will see you next time, whenever that may be.